Well, welcome to session 12 of How to Enjoy the Bible. We're going to continue here talking about the Gospels and about Scripture buildup and how that can help us understand the Scriptures better in this particular part of the Bible. I want to talk a little bit about the Gospels here just to get us going. The Gospels, as we learned in a previous session about genre, have a unique feature to them. They are both part history and part biography. And they chronicle, in a sense, the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And so they contain parts about his life, which is the biographical elements, but then they also contain historical references and narrative, which would be considered historiography. And so it's really this combination of history and biography that we get this unique genre called historio biography, which is not uncommon in the ancient world. There was an entire genre called bios, or the Greek word where we get the English word life. And it was that people would write about a person's life, and they would mix it between some of the things they did, some of the things they said, and they would try to portray that individual in a certain light for the reader to understand them. In the Bible, when it comes to the Gospels, we have four of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of them is a bios of Jesus of Nazareth. And so we get four depictions, you could say, or dimensions, portraits of Jesus of Nazareth, because no two Gospels are the same. Each one contains unique content that tries to present the life of Jesus of Nazareth in a particular way for the reader. In order to kind of understand what that means to have four dimensions or four portraits of Jesus, I'd like to read an extended quote which is from a book that addresses one of the major questions that is raised when we think about four different portraits of Jesus. Well, it's from a book called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels by Michael Licona. And in the foreword, which was written by a scholar named Craig Evans, he writes this: "All who read the New Testament Gospels carefully will observe a great many similarities and a great many differences. The similarities are what we expect. After all, the four Gospels are talking about the same person, Jesus of Nazareth. It is the observation of the differences that creates the problem. The wording of something Jesus says appears in two or three forms in the Gospels. Sometimes where Jesus says it differs from one Gospel to another. How is this to be explained? Should these discrepancies be regarded as errors? Were the Gospel writers poor historians? Have they told the truth about Jesus? It is very understandable that modern readers of the Gospels raise these questions. If historians today produced parallel accounts of the life and accomplishments of a United States president or a British prime minister, which exhibited the kinds of discrepancies that we find in the Gospels, no doubt their work would be sharply criticized. In large part, this explains the problem. We moderns have very different expectations of what constitutes historiography, or the writing of history. Most of us have no idea how the ancients understood history or how it should be written. Many of us probably assume that the ancients wrote their histories the way we moderns do, or at least tried to. If we think this, we are wrong. In fact, many of us have little idea how the ancients thought the life and teaching of a great man should be preserved and passed on. This is especially important in the case of someone like Jesus, who as a teacher or rabbi taught disciples, learners, how he taught, what he expected his disciples to learn, and how he expected them to teach others all come into play in the writing of the Gospels. In other words, the pedagogy, which is the manner of teaching of Jesus, is every bit as important as ancient historiography for understanding the Gospels and why they tell the story of Jesus differently. What Craig Evans' point is that when we read the Gospels, we're not reading a modern piece of literature. We're reading an ancient piece of literature. And therefore, the literature that we are accustomed to and are familiar with in our day and time is not like the ancient literature. When we think of a biography today, we think of a very careful, chronicled, point by point, fact by fact, ordered recounting of a person's life. But that's not the way they did it in the ancient world. The Gospels followed the ancient bios tradition, which was to present a person's life in a particular way to have the reader have an impression of who the person was. And that sometimes was arranged by topical ordering of certain things that they taught so that it was all collected together in one place. Or in order to give the sense of a person having a time of life that was had a lot of accomplishment, they would have sequence of things that they did one after the other, but then perhaps later on would talk about something else that predated them all. And so when we think about the Gospels, there is an element of chronology, but then they are not absolutely chronological with respect to each other. But that doesn't mean we can't read them in light of each other. See, when you read the Gospels, you can read them two ways. One is that you can read them as they are vertically going through them. So you read one gospel straight through. Or you read another gospel from the beginning to the end. I'm calling this the vertical reading, going down through one gospel. But then there's also the horizontal reading of the Gospels, where perhaps you have Matthew and Mark will share some information. Maybe not the same place in the gospel, but they talk about a similar event or the same thing Jesus said. Sometimes you'll have Matthew will have something left out that he didn't include that Mark, Luke, and John have. Or maybe Mark and Luke share two things that the other two do not. And this is called single, double, and triple tradition within the Gospels because, and this is particularly with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are called Synoptic Gospels from a Greek word, synoptikos, meaning to look at them together, where we get the word optics from, and the prefix soon, together. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they cover so much of the same content of Jesus' life. And so reading horizontally across these three can, as we saw in the last session, can bring to light additional information and understanding about Jesus and his life and his ministry. And so I'm going to continue on here in this session, and we're going to look at an account, a triple tradition account that occurs in all three of these Synoptic Gospels. And I want to look at the different pieces of information that each of the Gospels include or exclude and remark on them. Now, we're going to be looking at a section of Scripture that is quite complicated. We're going to look at Jesus' teaching on the end times, the signs of the end of the age, and the coming of the Son of Man, which is a reference to his return. So in the notes, I have given you guys these three parallel accounts. The text may be a little small on the screen, so please follow along in your notes. Now, we're going to do quite a bit of reading here because these accounts are lengthy. But I think that there will be a lot of value to looking at these whole accounts side by side, horizontally against one another. So we're going to read here through most of Luke chapter 21 to get us started. Luke chapter 21, it begins in verse 5. And while some were speaking of the temple, how It was adorned with noble stones and offerings. He said, this is Jesus, he said, as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they asked him, Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, See that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Then he said to them, Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. There will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants. In those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And he told them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning, all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. Now, this record is also depicted in Matthew chapter 24. Let me reveal Matthew 24 for you here. And let's see if we can notice any differences as we read through this account again. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. I think we find a lot of parallel content here being reiterated. As he sat on the Mount of Olives. Well, that seems new. It's actually telling us where this is occurring. Back in Luke 21, it just says, while some were speaking of the temple. Now, previously in the account, Jesus was in the temple. But we have no designation here spatially of where he currently is. They might be leaving the temple, walking beside the temple. We're not sure. But here in Matthew now, in what he's saying here, this is going to be taking place on the Mount of Olives. And it says, the disciples came to him. So now we know who is actually asking this particular stuff. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Well, that's a new part of the question that they're asking. Over here in Luke 21, they asked, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? But the disciples over here are asking, well, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The question is a little bit different here, and this will become important as we keep reading. Verse 4, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Over here, in Luke 21, Jesus says, but before all this, and then he goes on to explain something that will happen before this issue of nation rising against nation, because that's what he says here next in verse 7 of Matthew 24. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Up here in verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved. There's a similar statement to verse 19 of Luke 21. By your endurance, you will gain your lives. But in Luke 21, Jesus doesn't talk about the end coming after that. In Matthew 24, though, that is a statement that Jesus makes because as we go and see next in verse 15, he now talks about something that is not part of Luke chapter 21, the abomination of desolation. Let's read this section here. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, this whole section is absent from Luke chapter 21. It actually really goes right here. This is where the abomination of desolation takes place. Because what happens after that is you have the coming of the Son of Man in verse 29, which is where Luke picks up in verse 25. Now, you remember, as I told you in the beginning, that the questions that are asked are important here. The questions that are asked in Luke are about when these things, referring to the destruction of the temple, will take place. There's no question asked about when the end of the age will take place. But that is a question that is asked in Matthew chapter 24. So what we find is Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in Luke chapter 21, all the way up to Luke 21:24, where he says, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." That's actually a reference to the church age right now with the inclusion of the Gentiles in the covenant. And that Jerusalem will be trampled is a reference to the destruction from AD 70 when the Roman Empire came in and destroyed the city and the temple. And that was the fulfillment of that prophecy that Jesus gave at the beginning about that not one stone upon another will be left, but all will be thrown down. So now we have in Matthew 24 this abomination of desolation section. And this section relates to the end, the question of what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. You see, we see here in verse 6, the end is not yet. And then verse 8, all this description, these are just the beginning of the birth pains. It's not actually the birth. It's just leading up to it. However, when we come to verse 14, the statement is said that after these things, then the end will come. And so now Matthew in verse 15 here is going to begin speaking about the sign of the end of the age. And what we just read with the fulfillment of the prophecy of the prophet Daniel about the abomination of desolation. Let's continue reading in Matthew 24 in verse 29, and we'll pick up here the coming of the Son of Man, which corresponds to Luke chapter 21, verse 25. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch comes out or becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Verse 36, we have new content here that is not part of the record in Luke chapter 21. Jesus continues on to talk about that day, meaning the day of his coming. He says in verse 36, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two men will be in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This whole final section from verse 36 on does not appear in Luke chapter 21. As Luke chapter 21, we see, is really focused on answering a question about the destruction of the temple, but does touch on the coming of the Son of Man beginning in verse 25, and also uses the lesson of the fig tree like we see here in Matthew as well. But then gives a final exhortation about being watchful and staying awake. Whereas in Matthew 36, there's a whole explanation of the surprise, you could say the coming of the Son of Man in a secret time or in a time unknown, so that it comes upon them suddenly, like in the days of Noah, where the flood, the people who were just eating, drinking, and marrying and everything, they didn't know what was coming until it was too late and it had come. And that's what Matthew is showing here about the coming of the Son of Man is in a similar way. And the parable about the faithful servant who knows that the master will be returning and therefore is faithfully busy about the business that they should be and not frolicking and eating and drinking with drunkards. But the foolish servant who's doing that, the master will return and they will be punished. They will be cut in pieces and thrown out with the hypocrites, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, let's read the final record in Mark chapter 13 and see if we can see other differences that exist between these records. All right, Mark chapter 13, beginning of the chapter here, verse 1. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples, this is referring to Jesus, so he's leaving the temple. We have a reference here, a spatial reference. One of his disciples, we have a reference of person, said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? Referring to the temple here. There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, so we have another spatial reference here. They're on the Mount of Olives. We have another reference that the Mount of Olives is opposite the temple. It's actually across the Kidron Valley. And we have another reference of persons. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew are the disciples mentioned in Matthew chapter 24. These four are said to be asking Jesus privately, which is what we see in verse 3 of Matthew 24. So in verse 4 of Mark 13 here, this is what they're asking Jesus. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? So they're asking, when will these things be? and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. Is some of this sounding familiar here? I think we saw this information over here in Matthew 24. I'm just going to draw some parallel arrows here. Verse 9. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The one who endures to the end will be saved is written in Luke chapter 21, verse 19. And it should also be here in Matthew, I believe. Let me look. Verse 13, right here at the bottom. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So again, we have parallel content being shared among all three. And even over here in verse 10, the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. Well, in verse 14 here in Matthew 24, this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout all the world as a testimony to all nations. A lot of overlap going on here. Now we see in Mark chapter 13, here when we get to verse 14, we see that it's now going to pick up the same section that Matthew 24 had that was absent from Luke 21. It'll be the abomination of desolation. A lot of this content will be parallel, but I just want to read through it here. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, one thing to point out, Mark does not identify this prophecy of the abomination of desolation as coming from or being the one spoken of by Daniel. That's something that Matthew puts in specifically here. Standing where he ought not to, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter, for in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. This is a point that Matthew made as well in chapter 24. There will be great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world. Verse 20, and if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. This is stuff that Matthew also mentioned in chapter 24. Verse 23, but be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. And now the coming of the Son of Man section. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Let me draw a line here so you guys can see. The lesson of the fig tree occurs in all three. We'll get to that next in Mark chapter 13. But then I want to kind of come up here and show you that the coming of the Son of Man here is also bracketed. So that in Matthew 24 and Luke, we have this abomination of desolation section that occurs. So one of the things when reading horizontally across the Gospels, as we are doing, is it's good to find out where they line up, and then where's the difference in the Gospels. What is added here, or what is added there, or what's missing? And it's easy to do that by just drawing lines around these sections. And there are books that actually have all four Gospels paralleled in them to allow you to read them in parallel columns so that you can do what we're doing here tonight. I want to continue here in Mark chapter 13 to finish out this record and then give some final concluding remarks. So in verse 28, the lesson of the fig tree. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, this next section is what we saw in Matthew. That's an extension that was not present in Luke 21. The hour that no one knows. But concerning that day or the hour, no one knows, but not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Mark doesn't include what Matthew does about the time of Noah, and also doesn't include the faithful and wise servant parable at the end, but does talk about the kind of like a little bit of an allegory of the master that will come at a different time, but doesn't include here this section about if the master knew when the thief was coming. So there's some unique parts to Mark, but by and large, a majority of Mark's content is replicated in Matthew. But as we saw that between Luke and Mark and Matthew, there are large differences. And a lot of that can be attributed to the focus that Luke is trying to have. Luke gives, as you read the Gospel of Luke, Luke has a very large focus on Jerusalem and on the work that Jesus does there. And so for him to be focusing on that particular aspect of what Jesus is teaching his disciples about the destruction that's coming, and specifically talks about being aware of when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And as I mentioned before, this is fulfilled in AD 70 when the Roman armies came and they encamped around Jerusalem and they surrounded it and they trampled it down. And this is something that Matthew and Mark don't include, but they focus more on the abomination of desolation and the sign of the end of the age, and some more descriptions about staying awake and a parable and an analogy. And so what we can see from these different records as we look through them are the unique characteristics of the gospel writers. And it helps us give an appreciation to understand this particular part of Jesus' teachings about the end times. So thank you for going through this with me, and I hope that you guys are able to read the Gospels and look across horizontally as well as vertically and gain a greater appreciation for what God has revealed to us in His Word. Thank you.